So first, you control the ability to mute or unmute yourself through the Zoom menu. When the icon is red and has a line through it, your microphone is muted. Please stay muted when you're not speaking. During a call for a vote and after each presentation, you can unmute your microphone and members can vote as a group. If needed, the chair may ask for a roll call vote where each member can respond with their name when their name is called by the moderator or designated staff. If you have a poor quality internet connection, try turning off other programs, turning off your web camera, and connecting directly to internet rather than going through Wi-Fi. And a reminder that while PAG and RTA meetings are conducted virtually, we want to remind committee members that the meetings are open to the public. Committee members are obligated to comply with Arizona's open meeting law and only discuss matters on the agenda during the public meeting. Also, pursuant to the state's open meeting law, committee members shall not discuss with a quorum of the committee at any time any matter that may be presented to the committee for discussion or action. And that's all.
Thank you, Melanie, for your help with that. We have an excellent lineup of presenters today. We'll be talking about PFAS and CAP water availability. And Mead, would you like to talk about PAG's purpose for assembling these speakers?
Yes, thank you, Marie. So first of all, I wanted to say we're grateful to our presenters today for offering to share with us. This PFAS topic in particular is one of our top EPAC issues. Annually, we update those issue lists and cover them through meetings. And in addition, it is in our 208 plan, it is one of the action items. So EPAC has been covering the topic mostly from a drinking water management perspective and then some groundwater monitoring. So today we're bringing to you something a little different. We're looking at effluent and a new permit that'll help ensure continuing strategies to mitigate the plume and PFAS treated water that will create flow in the Santa Cruz River. So that is a new permit. PAG, as the designated planning agency for under Section 208 of the Clean Water Act, is the area-wide water quality management agency, which means that we review discharge permits with the goal of encouraging coordination locally and cohesion with local policies. So this meeting is not required through our process, but we wanted to bring it to you for ongoing coordination. And I also wanted just to give a quick thanks to ADQ, Tucson Water, and Pima County for being so proactive on this PFAS issue. And that's all I have to share for getting the meeting started.
Thank you, Mead, for providing this forum for everyone to share this information. I want to let you know that there are 29 participants here today. I'm not sure if you all can see who's here, but I do want to acknowledge that we have Pima Association of Governments, Tucson Water, Pima County, a number of departments, Central Arizona Project, Town of Marana, ADEQ, and the Sonoran Institute. Are there people who are organizations that I might have missed? You could unmute yourself or raise your hand.
Good morning, Nemesis Ortiz with the Arizona Department of Water Resources.
Yes, thank you very much. Anybody else? All right, thank you very much. And now what we will do is have an opportunity for you to show your in-kind participation in this meeting. And Melanie Alvarez, would you like to talk about more about this?
Of course. For in-kind reporting, our regional planning efforts are enhanced by recording time donated by attendees, volunteers, and participants. PAG collects data on the time dedicated to meetings and activities to apply for use as matching funds for grants and federal dollars. If you're paid with federal dollars, please let us know now. Time spent in preparation for this meeting will be estimated by PAG staff who are knowledgeable of the agenda and meeting materials. At the conclusion of this meeting, the session report will automatically calculate your time spent in this meeting. Time spent working on PAG and RTA initiatives, programs, and special projects may also be eligible for consideration for matching funds. And we really appreciate all of your in-kind contributions.
Thank you, Melanie. Now we'll move on to the next topic, which is the approval of the previous meeting that was held on January 27, 2020. And I want to let you all know that there is a link for the meeting summary, and that was in your agenda. And wanted to ask if there was any discussion about the meeting summary. All right. For those of you who can vote, please unmute your microphone and we'll take a vote. Actually, I should say this. Is there a motion to accept the meeting summary?
Make the motion.
Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Luke and Paula. And now we'll have the vote. If you would unmute, and when all those in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed say nay. Sounds like the meeting summary is approved unanimously. Thank you very much. Okay, our first presenter this afternoon is Jeff Prabhat, who is the Deputy Director with Pima County's Regional Wastewater Reclamation Department. And he's going to be talking about the PFAS in effluent in wastewater biosolids and effluent limitation guidelines and their remote resulting management strategies. Take it away, Jeff.
Thank you, Marie. And thank you for all inviting me here today. So this is a presentation maybe a few of you have seen in the past. We presented at AZ Water, so I apologize if it's repetitive, and hopefully for most of you, it'll be the first time you viewed it. So this project really came about in 2020 as a result of the PFAS in groundwater towards the Davis-Monthan wells out there that Tucson Water has been combating with, and also Marana has been having some challenges with PFAS in their wells to the south of town. And so from Pima County's perspective, you know, what we see in the sewage is a mirror. It's reflecting what our community uses and what comes to us. We don't treat for PFAS compounds. We treat for quite a few number of other traditional pollutants, but PFAS isn't one of them. And so our concern and our Board of Supervisors' concern was that the biosolids that we've been applying for beneficial use for agricultural areas in Marana for the last 40 years, is PFAS an issue, and is it contributing to the groundwater pollution? And so that's why we launched this study. In January of 2020, the Board of Supervisors opted not to renew our contract for land application of biosolids, which provided us roughly about a 1-year moratorium on land application. Instead, we were taking it to landfill for disposal. And So this was 2020 during the pandemic. So we devised this study in conjunction with Jacobs Engineering and the University of Arizona and ourselves. And all the sampling was probably done, I would say, May through July. All the analysis were performed by Eurofin's labs in California. And we ended up publishing a report and an academic paper on it. So I'm going to run through this real quick and show you the work we've done and some of the conclusions that we got from that. And so this timeline kind of starts out over here in the 1930s when PFAS was developed, the different industrial uses for PFAS, all the way up until 2000 when EPA started to begin to look at this issue, and some of the manufacturers were doing voluntary curtailment of PFAS usage in manufacturing in the US all the way to today. And so there's about 70 years of peak production before the first health advisory limits were put into place. Routine monitoring here in, I believe in Tucson, didn't largely begin until 2016 when EPA revised the health advisory limits. So we have very little historical data going back prior to 2016. We just weren't sampling for it or analyzing for it at that time. In 2018, ADEQ did a report for looking at public water systems and what PFAS levels were found throughout the state. And we began land applying biosolids probably around 1984 in the Marana area. And we've done that consistently with the exception of last year's when we had the moratorium. And so too many clicks of the mouse here. So why are we interested in PFAS? So this chart's from the CDC, and they first began monitoring for PFAS in human blood serum. So this chart represents US averages for children, for everybody over the age of 12. So this is adults and children over the age of 12. And interestingly enough, when they began this in the year 2000, they found PFAS everywhere. And so the first inclination was there was contamination of the sample sources or faulty analytics. They would have to go all the way back to archived samples, blood serum samples from enlisted military members from the Korean War, so the late 1950s, before they were able to not detect any PFAS in the bloodstream. So that's just how ubiquitous it was and how commonplace. So every American, everybody on the planet probably has some level of PFAS in their blood because we were exposed to it through those timeframes. And if you pay particularly attention to these final values from the last survey in 2016, 4.8 parts per billion for PFAS and 1.6 parts per billion for PFOA. Keep in mind those two numbers because we'll come back to these two when I show you the biosalt values that we find in soils. So apologize for the way that this formatted in this presentation here, but we've been sampling influent and effluent samples since 2016, and you do see PFAS and PFOA in our effluent samples at very low levels, often less than 20 parts per trillion in the effluent samples. So we do see it in our community and it's present, but it's not a significant value. So from our biosolid standpoint, we were very intrigued looking at the research literature that had been done to date. And if our application of biosolids followed these same trends. So this chart right here, this is a research article from PFAS Transportation in Soils. And what it demonstrates is PFAS largely attenuates in the first few inches, I think 40 centimeters, that's around 18 inches. And so PFAS really accumulates in the upper half of the soil and is either attenuated or it's uptaken by the crops. We don't see a lot of PFAS migrating further than that. So smaller chains do, but not the longer change polymers. Another research article we were intrigued by is this one coming out of Purdue. And what they found is that PFAS leaching from solids, this is primary sludge. So this isn't the first step of the treatment process. Primary sludge is then typically sent to our digesters. It's anaerobically digested. We create biosolids from that, and the resulting biosolids are what we apply on farm fields. So this would be the primary sludge coming in a treatment plant. This chart on the right is the finished biosolids that get land applied. And as you can see, these concentrations up here, 1.5 and 1.0 for these two compounds, it's attenuated during the treatment process. And so they're fixed. These molecules are converted into other molecules, and largely PFOS is the, by and large, largest contributor we see in biosolids. But overall, it is attenuated to some extent. The good news for that is that this is the material we're applying to fields, and so PFOS is the one primarily we'd be interested in looking at. And then this research article, this was done by Mark Rougeau and Bo Go at the University of Arizona. Mark and Bo just recently got a $1.3 million EPA grant to study transport and retention in ideal soils, which we'll be performing at our West Center or at the Pima County Water Campus. So what they did is a mathematical model for release and transport, and they used two different soil types. These are synthetic soils, so these were different types of sand, and they simulated conditions for Tucson, Arizona, and a town in New Jersey. So one is very arid climates with very little rainfall. The other one would be, near saturation, constant rainfall with these two different soil types, mimicking two different parts of the U.S. New Jersey, that's a lot of places back east is where these compounds were manufactured. And so what was very intriguing, it was industrial simulation uses 100 milligrams per liter of PFOS, whereas the AFFF simulation used 1,000 milligrams per liter. And what's derived by these are how many years it takes for these compounds to migrate down 200 centimeters. And so we were very intrigued by this. This would be more indicative of what we'd see out at Davis-Monthan with these very high concentrations material. But we wanted to see what our impact is on the fields and groundwater to the south where we've been applying biosolids. And so we developed a sampling plan largely modeled after some that Michigan and some other states have done that have a very proactive stance on PFAS contamination. So this cutaway kind of shows where we're at right here. We have roughly around 200 feet to groundwater is where we're at in the Marana Basin, where we do a lot of agricultural use. And so our sampling would all take place in the first 1 to 6 feet sampling to mimic some of those research articles that said it's attenuated in the first 18 inches. So we went down to a total of 30 to 6 feet, which is what we've seen in some literature. And for the sample locations, what we did is we selected biosolids application sites based on the tonnage applied. So we had low tonnage, less than 20 tons per acre applications. This would have been over a 4 to 9 year interval. Then we had our moderate applications, 20 to 30 tons per acre over a long extended period of time. And then the ones that we've heavy loaded over 30 tons per acre for a short period of time. And we grouped these all into these color-coded groups, and these bubbles that are color-coded, these indicate where the sampling locations were throughout that greater Marana agricultural area. In total, there were 109 samples that were conducted. Our staff went through extensive efforts to avoid contamination as far as the sampling bottles. All the rinse water they used was decontaminated or pre-screened to ensure that it had no PFAS materials. The clothing they used, it's indicative that if the regular use of showering and application of cosmetics, in some instances sunscreens, they have PFAS compounds in there. So we had very strict protocol for staff on the days of their sampling, and we followed that extensively. When we went out to fields, we avoided the edge of the fields. That's where tractors would typically turn around. Irrigation sometimes doesn't reach all the way to the boundaries. So we would go with 75 feet in from any crop field. That way we are indicative of applications where PFAS had been applied to, and that we were ensured that enough irrigation water had been present to force migration downward. We used hand augers or power-assisted augers if necessary. And here's some photos of staff. These poor staff, they were out there in the middle of June and July last summer. In the heat of the summer, they would get out early in the morning, but trying to collect these samples was a daunting task, and ensuring that there's no contamination during the processing. We also sampled source water wells that were used to irrigate these crops. So this would be the groundwater well dumping into a canal distribution system. And that's where these where we got a lot of our sample for groundwater in that area. The sample results, at the time of this analysis, there weren't any EPA approved methods. We were using modified drinking water methods. All the analysis was performed by Eurofins Labs in California. We would sample, we would sieve the soil samples to remove any rocks and debris, weigh those, and then ship those off to Eurofins for analysis. Now EPA has approved a solid waste method that's applicable to waters, wastewater, soils as well. That didn't exist last year when we did our test though. Oh boy, I'm sorry these printed so funny on this. I should have looked at it prior. So for the contaminants that we're looking for, we looked at, this is roughly PFOS and PFOA, but for the largest amount, we typically would see total values. I'm going to look up on a different screen here just so I give you the correct value. Again, I apologize for not previewing it in advance. These sites, the highest groundwater contamination that we observed for groundwater monitoring actually was in sites that have never received any biosolids application, so that's indicative that there is PFAS contamination in some of these source irrigation water that's using for agriculture. And so every time you pump that groundwater up for irrigation purposes, you're kind of recontaminating the soil as well. But in this group, the largest sites with had groundwater contamination were those that have never received biosolids. We did see a little bit elevated in the mounts. Unfortunately, the way this chart reads, PFAS is down at the bottom, and it's going to scroll to the next slide as soon as I click it. So this table here, this is our 2020 biosolid sampling results. So typically we see a PFAS value of about 34 parts per billion. This is in our biosolids. And these were the 4 different sampling events that we did throughout last summer. So it kind of ranges between 14 and 36. PFOA quite a bit lower. And here are some sample results that we show from other parts of the country and some research articles as well. So overwhelmingly, we have lower than average PFAS values that we see nationwide, and that's probably largely because Arizona doesn't have a lot of industrial sources of PFAS. We weren't a manufacturing location, and so our values are quite a bit lower than some of these that are reported in literatures. We're 14 to 36. Some of these are 300 to 600, 800 to 200. So that's somewhat reassuring that our potential to contaminate groundwater is probably very low.
Jeff, we have about 10 minutes left.
Okay, thank you, Mead. So here's our undisturbed soil results. These are farm fields that have never received any biosolids or any agriculture. They're kind of virgin native desert soils, and we didn't find any PFAS in those. And these are results from just agricultural plots that have never received biosolids, just traditional farming activities. We see about a 2 part per billion PFAS level at the 1 foot and decreasing to the 6 foot level. Likewise, biosolids, these are our low tonnage applications over a short interval. They're almost identical to what we see in the no biosolids application sites. In the intermediate, the concentration of PFAS went from up to about 3.1, but it also diminished dramatically by the 6 foot interval. And the same with the 30 tons per year. These were our heaviest application rates. So we see a trend from about 1.6 to 4 parts per billion soil concentrations at the 1 foot level, but often less than half a part per billion at the 6 foot interval, regardless of how much biosolids or how long the duration was for biosolids applications. Here we show the attenuation at the 6 foot interval. Typically, it's always well above 84% at that 6 foot interval, with good correlation between all the sample sites. So we're fairly confident that with groundwater depths beyond 100 feet, we're likely never going to see contamination as a result from our biosolids application. And this information convinced the Board of Supervisors to allow us to resume land application in February of this year. after that 1-year moratorium. And just for the benefit of the crowd, when I'm talking soil levels and biosolids level, we're talking parts per billion. The levels that we see in groundwater, and those are in parts per trillion. So that's 1,000-fold difference is what we're talking about. And here for some reference, typically in the wastewater samples, I think I was saying we were 13 to 36 parts per trillion in our wastewater. And here's where our biosolids would be roughly 28 parts per billion, which would be 28,000 parts per trillion. But here are some of those sunscreen values. This is why we asked our staff not to apply cosmetics, sunscreens, shower, shampoo, or anything those days they were sampling. We didn't want any contamination of the samples from any of those products. This work that we did was made possible by Jacobs Engineering, the University of Arizona, National Science Foundation, and ourselves at Pima County. And this is available on our website if you'd like to download a copy of that report. And a few months ago, we just published our first research publication for this. Dr. Pepper, Mark Rousseau, myself, and Barbara Escobar. So if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer them in the remaining minutes that we have.
We still have about 6 minutes.
Any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Great. Well, thank you for having me.
I'll start with one in case people need a little time. Do you know if there's PFAS in fertilizers that could have also impacted the fields that do not receive biosolids?
Yes, and so interestingly, that up until about 2010, they were allowed the inert ingredients that are used in fertilizers and pesticides, predominantly pesticides. They would add PFAS as a wetting agent, but also to protect seeds from getting wet and impregnated. And so to prolong their life. And those were allowed to be up to 0.5% of the inert ingredients in those materials up until around 2010. Not sure what the concentration is now, but in some of those soil samples where we did detect PFAS in agricultural soils that have never received biosolids, that's probably the source.
And I had one more question as far as the effluent. As the federal government develops effluent limitation guidelines, is the county discussing preliminarily plans for treating the effluent, or even setting your own operational targets? Yeah,
so what we've done already is we have our compliance and regulatory affairs group. We have an industrial waste control group. They regulate all the industries that contribute to our collection system. They've been going out and canvassing the area since 2016 and meeting with the potential users of these PFAS compounds and trying to educate them and guaranteeing that there's a switch to a more amenable process. And the county did impose a moratorium on PFAS contributions. These would be from the Air National Guards or places like that who still use the foams for firefighting. We did apply a moratorium on that, and not a moratorium, but a complete ban on that is not allowed in the sewers. And we're trying to work with all the industry representatives to ensure that it's not happening. As far as a regulation from on a wastewater treatment is going to be tough, because unlike wells where you can treat specific wells with carbon or ion exchange, the contaminated wells, in a treatment process, you'd be treating all 65 million gallons coming into our community every day. That would be quite a daunting task. And so I think source control is the key. When I showed that first chart that showed the blood serum levels and how it's decreased dramatically since 2000, that's the result of source control. Once these manufacturers started curtailing their use of those products, we're naturally seeing the levels come down considerably. So that logic would hold true at a community level. Once we eliminate the sources of it, source control will be the best way to tackle it.
Thank you.
Hi, Jeff. This is Paula Panzino. I have a quick question about whether or not you compared the levels that you did find to any of the RSLs.
Yes, we did. And some states have soil remediation levels. We're pretty consistently well below those levels just because we didn't have any industrial sources of that to deal with in the beginning. I imagine if you looked at some soil concentrations near Davis-Monthan or where these fire training exercise was going, that may be a different story. We only looked at the land application sites or farming sites where we've been applying these materials.
Thank you.
Jeff, when you've done your outreach to these potential sources of PFAS, has there been a general response from the group? How would you say they've been responding to your request to stop discharging that?
So for the most part, what we saw here locally, it was metal plating industries who were using it. They would use it as a wetting agent to help improve the finish on parts, and also as a anti-evaporative agent in the plating processes. Fortunately, or unfortunately, most of all these activities in Tucson went somewhere else, offshore, out of country during the last recession around 2007. So we have very few of those still in existence here. And of the ones that we have met with, they've already voluntarily switched to different chemical processes. And so it's been, for the most part, kind of self-resolving. One thing that we did see are overwhelmingly all the values were less than 10 parts per trillion in our effluent, except for our Green Valley facility. We do see values in the 20 to 30 parts per trillion in Green Valley. And that's it's an elderly population, not a big industrial component at all. It does have a hospital. And so we're actively looking at that Green Valley saying, well, what's different about their influent waste streams that we don't see it at some of our other locations? And we've sent samples out for, the bleach that we use in treatment, the disinfectants, any kind of polymers that we use, any chemicals that we use in the treatment process. We've submitted those for analysis to make sure that we're not adding them during the treatment process. But for some reason, Green Valley is unique and we're not sure why. So we're actively trying to figure out what the source is out there. Could be some of the mining products or the chemical manufacturers who supply products or warehouse products out there for the mines. We just don't know at this point.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Jeff. And also want to thank you for developing your research out at Agua Nueva to do this advanced kind of research. We really appreciate that.
Thank you.
I wanted to now, I know Jeff had to leave at 2 o'clock, so he could go to another meeting. And we thank you very much. And so our next presenter is Jeff Biggs with Tucson Water, and he will talk about the PFAS management at the Tucson Airport Remediation Plant, as well as investigations at Sweetwater Wetlands and the Arizona Pollutant Discharge permit application that they're going through for their next, for these demonstration projects. Jeff, would you like to proceed?
Thank you, Maria. Greatly appreciate the opportunity to present Tucson Water's PFAS management. And as Marie said, talk about our Tarp facility, our drinking water system, and again, our reclaimed water system. So again, we're going to talk a little bit about regulatory overview. Our Tarp Superfund system, our potable system, and then our reclaim system. So by looking at this map, things are evolving quickly around the country. And the main reason that it is evolving so quickly and changing so often is that there is not an established maximum contaminant level for any PFAS contaminants. There is a EPA drinking water health advisory of 70 parts per trillion for PFOA plus PFOS. So again, because of that, different states are setting their own MCLs, health advisories, or cleanup levels. So because of that, Tucson Water back in late 2019, early 2020, we set our own internal water quality guideline for PFAS. And we selected these 6 PFAS contaminants for our internal guideline. And you can see the values for each individual PFAS contaminant there on the right. The big one that we really go by that we're concerned about is the 4th one down, the combined PFOS plus PFOA plus PFHXS plus PFHPA cannot exceed 18 parts per trillion. And again, that's an internal guideline that we have set. Now you may ask, well, how did you come up with 18 parts per trillion and these particular PFAS contaminants? Well, we certainly didn't, have a dartboard and start throwing darts at a dartboard just to pick numbers. There's a couple things we did. One, we did examine what other states are doing for either health advisories or MCLs. We looked at a lot of literature that's out there. And also, is almost as important, probably more important, is a few of us went to a science day back in October of 2019 for the multi-district litigation in Charleston, South Carolina that we are involved in. The city of Tucson filed suit against 3M in November of 2018, since they are the prime manufacturer of AFFF. So we went to the science day again in October of 19, learned a lot of information from both the defendants and the prosecution, but it really opened our eyes to other contaminants other than just PFOS and PFOA. So that's how we came about that 18 parts per trillion. So a little bit about TARP. I need to give a kind of a history of TARP for people who don't know about TARP. During and after World War II, aircraft maintenance activities occurred at the airport, and TCE, trichloroethylene, was a great solvent that was used for cleaning parts during that maintenance activities. Unfortunately, there was questionable disposable practices from the 1940s to the 1970s. And that's how the aquifer got contaminated with TCE. So in the early 1980s, Tucson Water shut off some of our drinking water wells, and some private wells were taken out of service due to TCE contamination. About that same time, the CERCLA process began, the Superfund process. And that remained through the rest of the 1980s into the early 1990s as that CERCLA process took its course. In 1994, the treatment facility, the Pat Cullum Aeration Treatment Facility, was actually constructed along with 9 remediation wells and the pipeline to connect those wells and up to the treatment plant. The picture at bottom center is the Pat Cullum aeration, the silver, the stainless steel vessels there. The water is pumped up to the top, trickles over what I like to describe kind of like wiffle baseballs. As kids, we used to play wiffle baseball, and that's kind of what they look like. It's stuffed inside those towers. The water trickles over those wiffle balls, air blows up from the bottom, removes the TCE. The water comes out the bottom. At the time, we added bleach for disinfection. That water would go to the distribution system. The vapor would be removed, and it would go through vapor phase granular activated carbon. Those are the 3 vessels to the right in that picture. That GAC would remove any remaining TCE that was in the vapor before that vapor was allowed to go into the atmosphere. The map on the right here, it shows the plume that the city of Tucson are responsible for, the TCE plume. We start at Los Reales Road, the red hatch line, and we go northwest. This plume originally was about 4 miles long and about 1 mile wide at its widest. About right in the middle of our plume is the South Well Field, where there is 5 remediation wells. And further north at the tip of the plume is the North Well Field, and there are 4 remediation wells there, so there's a total of 9 currently. Those wells pump contaminated groundwater up to the TARP treatment plant. Now, the South Well Field mainly was used to remove contaminated water, contaminant. The North well field also removes contaminated water, but it also is a barrier to prevent that plume from moving north into Tucson water drinking water system. So everything was going fine from 1994 till about March of 2002. At that time, I was contacted by Region 9 of EPA, who told me that other Superfund sites very similar to Tucson's, they were beginning to discover 1,4-dioxane. And 1,4-dioxane is a stabilizing agent for TCA. Now, TCA replaced TCE when TCE was banned. And everyone thought TCA was the next best thing for cleaning parts and using as a solvent. Well, unfortunately, it is just as hazardous as TCE. So I like to call that substitution regret. You think you're doing the right thing, but later on you find out that you're really not. So we began routine monitoring in the spring of 2002. We monitored all of our 75 monitoring wells within the Tarp plume, the remediation wells, and the water leaving the Tarp treatment plant. And from 2003, beginning of 2003, we also began bringing water in from an adjacent pressure zone because the EPA drinking water level at that time, the health advisory was 3 parts per billion. So to ensure that we kept our water leaving the Tarp treatment plant below 3 parts per billion, we actually blended water from the adjacent pressure zone and added that to the Tarp drinking water effluent before it reached the drinking water system to ensure we kept it below the 3 parts per billion. In 2011, EPA published a new drinking water health advisory for 1,4-dioxane. Remember, it was 3 parts per billion. In January of 2011, they dropped it, they lowered it to 0.35 parts per billion. And at that time, we knew that we could no longer blend water from the adjacent pressure zone and or manipulate the 9 remediation wells to keep that 1,4-dioxane levels below 0.35 parts per billion. We went to our mayor and council and they directed us to spend Tucson Water Funds, capital funds, to build an advanced oxidation treatment plant to remove 1,4-dioxane. So between 2011 and 2013, we did the advanced oxidation process, or AOP, design and construction of that facility. And in January of 2014, the treatment plant was completed and we actually began delivering treated water from that facility to the Tucson drinking water system. These are just some pictures. Upper left are the ultraviolet light reactors, the vessels. Upper right just shows each vessel has 72 lamps in each of the vessels. And the one on the bottom are the existing 8 granular activated carbon vessels. This is very important for later on as I discuss our PFAS situation. So just a schematic of the remediation wells on the lower left. Again, originally the water would go from those wells into the original Tarp water treatment plant, which is right to the left of it, go through the PAC column aeration and go to the drinking water system. When we designed the AOP treatment plant, we designed it as a pre-treatment because we knew it would not only remove 1,4-dioxane, but it would also remove TCE and all other VOCs, volatile organic compounds. So once it was constructed, the water from the remediation wells went through the advanced oxidation process treatment plant, which adds hydrogen peroxide just prior to the UV reactors. That combination of UV reactors and hydrogen peroxide is the oxidation, the advanced oxidation, which destroys the 1,4-dioxane molecules. But we have to add excess hydrogen peroxide. So that water goes through the granular activated carbon contactors, which removes that excess hydrogen peroxide prior to going to the drinking water system. Now, because of the existing record of decision and the consent decree signed by the city of Tucson and other responsible parties with EPA, even though the water was treated, and was ready to be delivered to the drinking water system. Because of those enforceable documents, that water had to go through the packed column aeration treatment plant, even though it was doing nothing, but it still had to go through that process, all right, because it was the selected treatment for TCE and the consent decree. So we worked with EPA through water quality data to allow us to bypass the packed column aeration temporarily. So this diagram shows the water leaving the AOP bypasses the packed column aeration. We add bleach, and then it goes directly to the drinking water system. I'm going to talk a little bit about our enhanced recovery project. So these are really two important maps that we show many, many, many times because we get a lot of questions from the community that, you know, you've been pumping this water for a long time and we don't see any results. We don't see what's going on. So that's why we created these maps. So you look on the left, this is a 1987 Tce Plume Map. The airport is down at the bottom, down in this area. You can tell this is where a lot of the contamination occurred. The darker color is the higher concentrations of over 500 parts per billion of TCE. And as you see, as it moves southeast to northwest, the concentrations get less and less and less. And that's the way the natural groundwater flows. So this is prior to the construction of the 9 remediation wells and the packed column aeration treatment plant. But we put those, the north well field up at the top, the south well field, the red dots, just to show where they're at. So again, the treatment plant started in the fall of '94. And as you can tell, this is the same plume map in 2021. Again, we're down here. There's a little bit of the TCE remaining in the 50 to 100 part per billion range. Another pocket here. And then there's a pocket up here. Now, again, the city of Tucson is responsible for operating this plant from this plume from Los Reales Road to the north. This pocket of 50 to 100 part per billion TCE has just been sitting there since 1994. It doesn't get any smaller and it doesn't move. So the city and EPA started talking about how are we going to be able to reduce that pocket of TCE, and by the way, 1,4-dioxane, to try to finish up the cleanup of this plume. But we came up and we talked to the public about this, and there's a lot of concerns about this pocket of TCE sitting here. So what we decided to do after going working with EPA and going to our mayor and council, we have drilled a 10th well right in the middle of that green spot. That well has been drilled. The pipeline to connect it to those 4 north wellfield wells have been constructed. So again, this just shows what we've been doing since 1994. So what we've had to do with this enhanced recovery, again, like I mentioned, we drilled the new well, the 10th well. Because of that well, we're going to be removing more contaminated water and more volume of water. So because of that, we had to add another level of UV reactors. As you can see, the bottom right-hand corner, we have 3 levels now instead of just 2. And we had to add 4 additional granular activated carbon contactors. Also because the additional contamination. We also, by the way, are upgrading our existing communications. Originally, they were fiber optic. We now are converting them to radio. And again, we have at least temporarily retired the packed column aeration, but what we are working on is trying to permanently retire that packed column aeration by changing the existing record of decision and consent decree. So just some technical information. The cost of this project, which will end this year, this current calendar year, it'll be completed. We will add another 1,300 gallons per minute to a total capacity of 7,200 gallons per minute, or about 10.3 million gallons per day when all 10 wells are operating. And this project cost us $18.3 million. Again, Mayor and Council directed Tucson Water to pay for this upgrade out of our existing capital improvement budget. because they felt it was necessary to get this well drilled and to keep the contamination process moving. So everything was going great again, we thought. We were removing TCE, we were removing 1,4-dioxane. And as Jeff Pravat mentioned earlier, in 2009 was the original EPA provisional health advisory for PFOA at 400 parts per trillion and 200 parts per trillion of PFOS, pretty high numbers. We began sampling actually in the Tarp plume in around 2013 to 2014. And all indications showed that we were well below the EPA provisional health advisory. We continued monitoring, but in May of 2016, just like with dioxane, EPA lowered the drinking water health advisory. So now they lowered the PFOA plus PFOS to 70 parts per trillion. Again, we took note of that. We continued to do our sampling and monitoring, and everything was fine. The levels were well below that 70 parts per trillion. Between then and 2018, we started to see indications that the levels of PFOS were beginning to increase in the water coming into the Tarp facility, and this caused us concern. So we began thinking, what are we going to do because of this PFOS contamination? So we did a few things. At that time, just like we did with dioxane, we began manipulating the operation of the remediation wells to lower that PFOS level coming into the Tarp treatment plant. We began again blending water from the adjacent pressure zone. And we also began changing out the GAC, the granular activated carbon, within the existing 8 vessels. We also did some bench scale testing for granular activated carbon and ion exchange, looking at long-term mitigation. And we looked at what that might be as far as what kind of treatment and where that treatment might go if we chose to go that path. So again, started in 2019, we continued our GAC changeouts. So far, we have changed out those 8 vessels 4 times at a total cost of about $2 million, again, that the Tucson water ratepayers are paying for. So just a little information on the GAC. This is shows a picture of the vessels there on the bottom and one of the trucks that was used to add the new GAC. We got to remember that we picked a carbon originally that would be used for quenching the excess hydrogen peroxide that I talked about before. But we also now had to pick a carbon that also removed PFOS contaminant. And we did find one that worked best, and we've been using it for the 4 changeouts. We also added 4,000 pounds of extra media in each of these vessels. So now we have 18,000 pounds in each of these vessels, which increases the empty bed contact time of those vessels. We are doing weekly sampling of PFOS. Over here on the right-hand side, that picture shows 4 different sample ports in each of the vessels. So while the Tarp treatment plant is running, we were grabbing 4 samples out of each of these vessels weekly and analyzing them for PFOS, along with the remediation wells and the water leaving the Tarp treatment plant. So again, these are the dates of the 4 changeouts of GAC in those vessels. This is just a snapshot of the 4 PFOS constituents that we are concerned about. And again, this is just a running average beginning in February of 2019 to April of 2021. So a little bit about this chart on the left is the parts per trillion of the 4 PFOS constituents that we are concerned about. The red solid line towards the top is the 70 parts per trillion current EPA Safe Drinking Water Act Health Advisory for PFOA plus PFOS. The hatch red is the 18 part per trillion of Tucson Water's operational guideline of those 4 PFOS constituents. And then at the bottom, down at the low, is the green hatch line. That's the method reporting limit, the MRL, or as some people call it, the non-detect. Each of those PFAS contaminants have a method reporting limit of 2 parts per trillion, very, very low levels. And you can tell the water coming in, at least at this average snapshot, was just under 70 parts per trillion. That raw water coming in from the remediation wells can vary anywhere from up to 125 down to where it is in this snapshot, depending on what remediation wells are operating at the time. But as you can tell, as the water goes through the treatment plant and goes through the GAC, the treated water leaving the plant is less than 2 parts per trillion, which is non-detect. And as it gets into the Santa Cruz Lane Reservoir, which is actually our reservoir that just prior to delivering to the public is also below detection limit of 2 parts per trillion. So we noticed and we had very concern about the levels of PFAS coming or rising or increasing in the remediation wells and near the remediation wells outside the Air National Guard and the Tucson Airport Authority. And we knew that water was heading towards the remediation wells. And we'd actually seen levels within the south well field and the north well field of PFAS levels increasing. So the city of Tucson, after long discussions and thought, on June 21st, 2021, just this past summer, shut down the Tarp facility due to these rising levels of PFAS. Because we are a drinking water facility and our number one priority is to protect the public health, the facility was shut down because these high levels of PFAS coming towards us, and we really were uncomfortable with those levels and how those levels might affect the treatment facility. So prior to the shutdown, we are actually also working with EPA in discussing the challenges that we have with PFAS. And they understood that as a drinking water utility, we were kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. You know, it's our responsibility to deliver this water, because of the consent decree, to the drinking water system. It's called beneficial use. And that was part of the record of decision, that we had to deliver this water to the drinking water system, unless it exceeded a maximum contaminant level, an enforceable MCL. So we started talking to EPA about how can we change that beneficial use part of the consent decree to allow the city of Tucson to have some flexibility in delivering this treated Tarp water. Again, impacts of the PFAS levels are increasing. Our commitment to treated water quality. And we really didn't need for a demand of our drinking water system, that water coming from the Tarp facility. Things were different in 1994. We relied solely upon groundwater in 94. Now we rely mostly on Colorado River water out in our valley. So the water coming from the Tarp facility really is not necessary anymore, needed for our drinking water system. So we talked to EPA, and through many discussions, they allowed us to start a permanent project where that we are going to build the infrastructure to deliver the Tarp treated water. I need to stress treated Tarp water, no different than the water that we were delivering to the public. But we will be able to deliver it to the Tucson Water Reclaim System, for turf irrigation, and at the same time also to the Santa Cruz River as a stream feature. It's very, very similar as our Heritage project that is currently in operation. Again, working very closely with EPA and ADQ, and this project, the permanent project, is scheduled to be completed in early 2022. So I want to talk a little more specifics about this project. I want to talk first about the temporary. On the left is a map showing the north end of the Tarp treatment plant. So again, working with EPA and ADQ, and by the way, we want to thank ADQ for providing $2 million to help us build this temporary and permanent infrastructure to get water from the Tarp treatment plant into the Santa Cruz River as quickly as possible. Because again, the plant was shut down June 21st of 2021. We knew by study that the remediation wells can remain offline for probably 6 to 12 months without the plume moving north, or to the point where we can't bring that contaminated water back. So we knew we had to get this plant up and running as quickly as possible. So again, ADQ provided $2 million to help us build this a 24-inch temporary pipeline that'll come from the Tarp treatment plant. It'll connect with a permanent pipeline that we are constructing at the same time. We are also constructing a outfall, a river outfall, that will allow that water to flow into the Santa Cruz River. The outfall is being constructed right now. We just punched through the end of last week. So we are putting in the casing in the pipeline and the outfall. And we've worked very closely with Pima County Regional Flood Control District on this outfall and the water flowing into the Santa Cruz River. They've approved of the design and the permitting at the same time. Now on the right-hand side of this slide shows the permanent pipeline route. Over on the bottom left shows the Tarp water treatment plant. The red line is a new 24-inch permanent pipeline that'll run north out of the Tarp treatment plant. It'll head east to I-19. We will do a jack and bore, which means we will dig underneath. We will bore underneath I-19, which will allow to place a 42-inch casing and then the 24-inch line inside that casing. It'll come back out on the east side of I-19. That 24-inch line will run along MacArthur, go north up to Michigan, go east on Michigan past CE Rowe School, which is there at 12th Avenue and Michigan. We have done another jack and bore underneath 12th Avenue, come back up on the east side of 12th. And now we are installing the 24-inch pipeline to the east over way to Lundy. We're going to stop there until we're almost completed. Then we'll attach it to the existing 36-inch reclaim line, which is the purple line there on the east. So we've completed the 24-inch line along Michigan west of 12th. We are in the process of completing the pipeline east of 12th. We have the final design and will begin installing the 24-inch line along MacArthur east of 19. They've dug the boring hole on the west side of I-19. So then we can get equipment there and start boring underneath I-19. Again, like I mentioned earlier, we are constructing the outfall to the river, which is a permanent outfall. So the last piece of pipeline that'll be done is the stretch west of I-19 down to the Tarp treatment plant and over to the permanent outfall. It's important to know that besides the permits that we've been working with flood control, we've been working very, very closely with ADQ on our ZIPDs permit. This is really important permit. In fact, the public comment is open right now. It opened, I believe, September 3rd and will close on Sunday, October 4th. And then at that point, ADQ will be looking at all those comments. I'm sure they will be looking at the comments during that time to address any concerns. And then we are hoping that once all those comments are addressed, we will get our ZIPDs permit and will allow us to start discharging treated Tarp water into the Santa Cruz River, which then will allow that plume to be contained until that permanent project is done in the spring of 2022, when we will be able to run all 10 remediation wells. And again, really start up that process of containing and removing the contaminants within that plume. So again, we've worked very closely with ADQ on this Zipties permit also. So let's
And
jump to
we
the
have about 5 minutes left.
got it. Thank you, Mead.
Thank you.
So talk about the potable water system. This map just shows two things. All the blue dots are all the over 200 drinking water wells that Tucson Water has. Many of those are not used because over on the Outnaver Valley, we use Colorado River water that has been recharged into the ground and pump that out. The red hatch line shows many of the established contaminated plumes in the area, and also down towards Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, the contamination from PFAS and near the Air National Guard, and up in the northwest, the PFAS and 1,4-dioxane contamination. Close-up of some of our wells and some of ADQ's monitor wells and some of DM's wells. You can see we've shut off many wells in this area because of PFAS contamination. One of those wells at the bottom is a DM monitoring well that was over 14,000 parts per trillion. Again, ADQ is working on the Central Tucson PFAS project. We greatly appreciate that. They're spending about $3.3 million on this pilot project. So with that 3.3 and the 2 million to Tucson Water, this is great. We really appreciate how they're helping the community dealing with PFAS. Also, we evaluated our northwest area production wells. You see these here. I won't go into too much detail, but we did some preliminary design of some treatment of some clustering of the wells. And some of these wells have not just PFAS, but also 1,4-dioxane. And then the reclaim system, on the right, the purple is the reclaim distribution system. You can see it goes up into Dove Mountain and also over into Oro Valley. On the left is just a breakdown of where that reclaimed water is used. Of course, the majority of it is golf courses and other irrigation system. Just some system data, but I do like the picture right in the center. It shows solar panels and renewable water. Can't get much better than that. And the reclaim system provides about 8 to 10% of our total water demand. So it's really important to the community. Also, there's a lot of PFAS contamination at our extraction wells that we use for delivering reclaimed water. And it's all along the Santa Cruz River. So that PFAS contamination has flowed down the river. And as Jeff mentioned earlier, it has gone through the treatment plants, the wastewater treatment plants, and it's gone into the aquifer that we use. So we're trying to maximize the deliveries from Agua Nueva instead of our extraction wells, which is hard to do during high demand times. And with that, I'm done. Sorry for the quickness of the last bits of information.
Thank you, Jeff, for going through all that information. I'm sure there are people who have some questions for you.
Feel free to raise your hand virtually or unmic yourself. I don't see any so far.
I've given this enough times, maybe everyone's heard it already.
Jeff, I do have, Luke has his hand up. Would you like to ask your question?
I would, thanks. I'm wondering when you can expect the water to start flowing into the Santa Cruz. I noted that you said that the project will be completed early next year, but do you have a sense of when the water will start to flow?
Yeah, we're again working with ADQ on the Zipties permit, which the public comment ends October 4th. We cannot put water in the Santa Cruz River until that permit is given to Tucson Water or the city of Tucson. But during this comment period, we're also doing all the construction necessary, the temporary piping and the construction of the outfall to start discharging a little bit of Tarp treated water into the Santa Cruz once we are given that permit. So we're hoping early October to start flowing some water out of Tarp treated water into the Santa Cruz River. And then the permanent project will be done next spring sometime. We're hoping maybe March or April of 2022.
Great news. Thanks, Jeff.
Yep.
Roxanne, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, I was gonna say, in the number of times he's given it, I apparently keep missing. Do you have a switch? Because you have the temporary let it go through the outfall to the Santa Cruz River, and then the permanent is putting it through the reclaim system. Is there a way to like shift that if you need to?
To the, I'm sorry, to the drinking water system or?
No, the reclaimed system?
Yeah, the temporary piping will only allow the water to go to the Santa Cruz River, okay? But in the spring, when the permanent piping is done, that water will come out of Tarp, it'll go into a 100,000 gallon wet well. And at that point, it'll be pumped to the reclaim system and or gravity fed to the Santa Cruz River outfall. So it can go to both at the same time.
Thank you.
You bet.
I have a related question. Marie, you go ahead.
I know there are 9 remediation wells, and at the end you were noting that there were 10 remediation wells. Are you adding another one?
Yes, I talked about the enhanced recovery earlier in the presentation, and that enhanced recovery was we've drilled a 10th well in that remaining pocket of higher levels of TCE and 1,4-dioxane. That well is really near 13th Avenue in Iowa, which is just south of where is that? Well, 13th in Iowa. So
That's good.
yeah, so that well has been drilled. We just haven't fired it up yet because we don't have this project done yet.
Thank you. Mead?
To tag on to Luke's question, do you think that you will have sort of a river celebration the way you did with the Heritage Project, or an announcement of its release date?
That's a good question, Mead. I mean, we've talked about it. In fact, we have another meeting this week to discuss that. What do we want to do? Do we just want to announce it, through the media? How do we want to talk about this? I mean, we've talked about this a lot. We've discussed it at the quarterly UCAB meetings with Southside residents. So they know what we're going to be doing. They support what we're doing. So we really haven't decided yet if we're going to have a big event or not. I doubt it very much because we're on such a time crunch right now. We just don't have that time, and we're still going to be doing construction work. It would just be very, very difficult to have some sort of a celebration. But maybe in the spring, when the permanent project is done, we'll have some sort of ribbon cutting or something like that.
Great.
Thank you. And Paula, you have a question?
Actually, I just wanted to let folks know that the pilot demonstration project, Central Tucson PFAS project, we have reached a service agreement with the Air Force. And so they will be providing some money to help pay for the demonstration project and possibly some of the full-scale project as well. So
Excellent.
Yeah.
That's great.
Thank you very much. This was going to be one of my questions about, I know that the city taxpayers have been funding the construction and operation of the Tarp treatment plant. And so I'm wondering with looking forward, I'm wondering what is your existing O&M for Tarp, which we might want to project in if there's going to be a full-scale treatment project separate from Tarp that would be recovering the PFAS. How much is your annual operation cost?
Sure, that's a good question. And actually, the existing Tarp treatment plant, the Pat column aeration, actually the O&M and capital is funded by a trust fund that was developed and provided by some of the responsible parties, mainly the Air Force. They supplied about $35 million back in the 90s, but that was just for TCE. The operation and cost of 1,4-dioxane and PFAS, they're not under the consent decree yet or the record of decision. So we're working on that also. The advanced oxidation process is about $1 million a year with power, things like that. I think it's important to note that the United States Air Force did reimburse the city of Tucson 90% of that $18.3 million of the original AOP construction. They provided that a few years ago. We are currently working with the Air Force to also for them to provide 90% of our O&M cost of that $1 million per year. We're very close on that. So we're working very hard about trying to get this money reimbursed. So and I think it's important to note that it's our ratepayers, not taxpayers, that are paying for all this. This is solely funded by our ratepayers. The PFAS, who knows what that's going to happen, but we do have that lawsuit with 3M. We're hoping some year that'll be decided and we can get some funding for that to pay for all of our PFAS contamination and the efforts that we've made.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Jeff. And also want to thank you tremendously for how quickly you have moved, and also for ABAQ and your collaboration with Tucson Water and the funding to do this demonstration project. Our next
quick note, real quick before you jump into the next one. If there are any viewers on YouTube who also have questions for Jeff, he has offered to answer those. You can contact him personally. Would you share your email? There it is. It's on the screen still. So we realize there may be additional questions out there.
Yes, please feel free to.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mead, and thank you, Jeff, for being so available to the public to answer their questions. Our next presenter is Mark Taylor with the Central Arizona Project. Talk to us about how things are going on the Colorado River and potential changes in the future. Mark, take it away.
All right, thank you, Marie. Can everybody hear me all right? And Mitch Biskupski is also on the line. He's on staff and he's our external coordinator, communication coordinator, so he's also with us today. So I think I have to hit that button to get going here. Not seeing my control of this. So there it goes. This is a little slow. I'll go pretty fast here. We don't have a lot of time, but I really want to mainly just hit what's going to happen with priorities and what's going to happen with our first tier 1 shortage coming up next year. And most of you know how it works essentially on the upper and lower basin. But as you can recall, you can see my pointer pretty well. Do I see that? Great. We're obviously in the lower basin. And when it comes to water rights, they've divided the basin into upper and lower basin. We get about 7.5 million acre feet per year. And that's pretty much a requirement for the upper basin to drop that much into the lower basin every year and on average over 10 years. But I want you to think of priorities. When we have a shortage, you have to think about who has the priorities to find out who's going to be cut. And while that's 7.5 million, Arizona has 2.8 million acre feet. You have to think again, well, California may have 4.4, but we have the lowest priority of anybody in the lower basin states. So if there's a shortage, we're going to generally be cut first before California and Nevada, and by a much greater amount. And so again, when there's a shortage, when we don't have our 7.5 million available in the lower basin, we're going to be cut first, and that's what we're going to be seeing. Also, it's good to know on the 2.8 million that we have, about 1 million of it is really allocated to the farmers and the Indian nations along the Colorado River, and they have the highest priority. So the 1.6, about 1.2 million is on the river. About 1.6 comes in through the Central Arizona Project. Again, thinking of prior appropriation, we had it first. We ended up building the CAP much later than the folks in the Colorado River using water. So we, again, when there's a shortage, it's going to come to Central Arizona Project, and the folks inside Arizona is going to have the first loss. So I just want to think about it from that standpoint. The gauge to determine if there's a shortage is always going to be the levels in the reservoirs themselves. So when you think of Arizona, you're going to think of Lake Mead. What is the elevation of Lake Mead? Lake Powell is really the regulating reservoir for the upper basins. Lake Mead is for the lower. But they are interconnected, and everything that the Bureau does in regulating the reservoirs and the river itself really is based upon both elevations. And, you know, for a lot of years, we've been able to stay above the 1075 elevation. It's been because of a lot of the conservation programs that we in the Arizona have done to keep that above 1075. But it's even been more affected by the releases from Lake Powell. And for several years, we've had a 9 million acre feet release based upon the elevations of Lake Powell. And that's really kept us above the 1075 for a lot of years, in addition to our system conservation. But now the projection is now you're going to have an 8.4 release this year and a 7.48 in the coming years. And with that dramatic reduction in releases from Lake Powell to Lake Mead, that's why we're seeing a very, very quick drop in Lake Mead's elevation. And unfortunately, a much quicker drop in Lake Mead's elevation in the coming years. And that's predicted, and that's why we're seeing not only a tier 1 projection, or not tier 1 for sure next year, but a potentially tier 2 and tier 3 projection over the next couple of years. One of the big issues and why we're having a lot less water going into Lake Powell is I'm going to really focus on the right. And I want you to focus on the bottom numbers here. We had in 2021, while we had a 7.16 million acre feet, which is an average amount of flow going into Lake Powell. In a normal year, we only had a 1.85 last year, 26%. Now, while we had a 90% snowpack, and that's what we usually look at. What's our snowpack? We had 90% of the snow. We only had 26% of the runoff. Now, why is that? You know, a lot of that is really based on these unusually very warm summers and springs. And when essentially you have a very hot summer, hot spring that dries out the soils, and the soils just soak up that water. So we may have a normal snowpack, but we're going to have much, much less water going to Lake Powell. And that really is kind of the cause of this whole thing, with the Lake Powell elevations being very low and the flows being very low. We're going to have much smaller releases going in Lake Mead, hence shortages that we're running into. What does that mean with DCP? We do take the brunt of it. And even though on the lower tiers, when we get into, you know, as you know, we're in a tier 1, which is less than 1075. Tier 2A is 1050, tier 2B is 1045, tier 3 is 1025. As a tier 1, we are going to lose about a third of our water going into central Arizona. We're going to lose about 512,000 acre feet. And again, the losses are totally taken by CAP, not the on-river users. So CAP of the 1.6 million, we're going to lose 512. And when we go into a tier 2A, then we'll go 592, tier 2B 640, and a tier 3 is 720. And as you know, there's a very good chance we'll be into a tier 2A in 1 or 2 years. Maybe by tier 24, we could be a tier 2B, and 25 tier 3. So we have a lot of potential losses. We will start hitting California. When they finally get to a tier 2B and a tier 3, California will start taking some losses. And that's only because of DCP. Otherwise, that wouldn't have happened. When we start losing 512,000 acre feet in the future, you got to recognize it's based upon priority system. Again, in central Arizona, who has the highest or lowest priority? If you look on the lower part of this blue, you can see that we will take about 1.1 million. Again, without DCP, that's what we will be able to accept. That means in the tier 1, we are not going to lose any water to the municipal industrial clients, i.e. Tucson Water, Oro Valley, Marana. All the municipal, they're not going to take a cut this year. The next tier of, and also the Indian Nations will not be taking a cut. The next tier above that, kind of through the middle of this line, is called NIA, non-Indian Ag. If it wasn't for DCP, they would take about a 60% cut. And then you'd lose all your excess water and all your regular ag pool water would all be lost. That is what's typical in a tier 1 shortage. In a tier 2 shortage, you may lose about 4 or 5% of your M&I water. In a tier 3, we're going to be pushing up to 14% of your NI water. I apologize, of your M&I water. You'll lose about 4% of your M&I water in a tier 2 and up to 14% of your M&I water in tier 3. So as we have higher and higher tier shortages, we will actually have to start some cuts into the municipal industrial water. But that isn't the case this year. In 2022, it's less dramatic because of drought contingency plan. As we said before, the tribes under 2022, tribes are not going to have any reduction. M&I not going to have any reduction. They wouldn't have anyway in a tier 1 shortage. But they don't show it here. But the NIA water, which would have had a 60% reduction, has a 0% reduction. So those folks who have NIA priorities will not have any reduction this year. And ag will only be reduced by 65% this year. Next year, it will be 100%. So this will be the last year that there'll be any ag water going to any of the ag communities who take CAP water. I want to throw this out. I know it's kind of confusing, a lot of information on here, but I think it's important. If you look in that lower right-hand corner, how much water that Arizona has put into system conservation in Lake Mead. And as I said, a lot of it depends on the flows and the releases from Lake Powell, but also a lot of it depends on everybody's contribution to saving water in Lake Mead. And as you can see, in 2021, even though we had a tier 1 shortage and we only had to save 192,000 acre feet, we saved 362,000 acre feet. So Arizona has been doing more than their share of keeping the elevations of Lake Mead up. And that's happened for the last several years. I think in 2020, we had over 300,000 acre feet. And so it's been quite a few years that we've had a lot of water not taken out of Lake Mead. The upper basin states are doing their part right now to try to keep the elevations of Lake Powell higher, even though they're dropping pretty precipitously. They have a lot at stake with the power generation, and they need to keep those to keep that minimum power pool up there. And they are doing a process called DOROA, kind of a weird name, but essentially that's releasing water in Flaming Gorge, Aspinall, and Navajo Reservoir. They're releasing about 181,000 earlier this year, throughout this year, to try to keep the Lake Powell up, and it'll be increasing that by about 3 feet. So that is one thing that the upper basin is doing to control Lake Powell. Well, how does it affect us here in Arizona, in Pima County and Tucson region? As you can see, we have 178,000 acre feet for 7 water providers. Obviously, the greatest is Tucson Water at 144,000 acre feet. They won't be affected this year. They're not going to have any losses. And I think the big difference to remember is everything is recharged and recovered in southern Arizona and Pima County. We don't have any treatment plants like they do up in Maricopa County. And so it's all high priority M&I contracts. We all put it in the ground, we all recharge it. And so it's really going to have no effect this year on it. As we go forward, we get into tier 2 and tier 3, then there will be some reductions of the M&I water. As far as tribal goes and irrigation, very little, if any, changes are going to happen. Tribal water is not going to lose any, and they use most of their water for irrigation. You know, BKW is one of the main users of CAP water in Pima County, but most of that's GSF water, if not all. I mean, it's really all GSF water. So anything that Tucson or Metro or Oro Valley want to put in the ground and recharge and maintain the long-term storage credits, they will continue to do that. And BKW and those farms will still get their water even under shortage condition. I know I'm going pretty fast, but I think that's the time I got here. So let me know when I need to stop.
You're doing
CAGRD.
good. About 5 minutes left.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Mead. CAGRD, I think going through this pretty fast, I think everybody knows it's pretty much divided. You know, we have member lands and we have service area lands. And you can kind of see how it's divided in here. The main thing to recognize is, you know, generally we have, I think it's about 35,000 acre feet. Let me see if I get that right. Of, yeah, there's 35,000 acre feet of replenishment obligations. You can see the total, we have about 60,000 acre feet currently today available. So we can definitely cover those replenishment obligations today. In addition to that, long-term storage credits that we can use. If we can't meet a replenishment obligation, we can always go to that in times of drought. We still have to note a lot of our 60,000 is NIA water, and that does have a lower, has a higher probability of shortage and not being available in shortage conditions. So they are definitely more vulnerable. But of course, our regular M&I water and Grick water and the Liberty effluent is very high priority water. So generally, while we do have a potential of losing our NIA water, probably will lose some of our NIA water, we can still cover our obligations. And I think that just goes through some more detail. I'm going to use my last few minutes as efficient as I can. Yeah, that's just a little more on CAGRD. I do want to get into prices though a little bit and have a little bit of time for questions at the end. Prices will be affected by a shortage. When you have less people, when you have a third of your water that's going to be cut and not be delivered, most of what we have is fixed cost. So we are going to have a larger M&I allocation of expenses that will have to be transferred each acre foot. So if you look at our prices right now, under this year, we're looking at everything from 21 all the way to 24 being considered, well, I'm sorry, 22 to 24 under the tier 1 category. And while that absolutely is the case for 2022, it may not be the case for the advisory 23 and 24. And one thing we don't have on the slide is a chart that you will find in our pricing structure that will say, how much will our normal pricing structure go up if 2023 becomes a tier 2 or 2024 becomes a tier 3? How much will these numbers go up? And right now you can see the total cost of all three is $242. That's for A, B, and C, which is our capital charges, our delivery charges, and our energy charges. All together are $242, and next year they're $256. But if it goes into a tier 2, tier 2B, that's going to go up an additional $15 an acre foot. So that could be up to the 270 range. If we go to a tier 3, the 284 will go up almost $30 to about 310 or so. So all that's in the charts. You can see that in the website. You can see it will be. We don't know whether we're going to hit your tier 2 or tier 3 coming up, but you can sure make those calculations based upon what the Bureau has projected. Going into CAGRD rates, Well, for Tucson, you can still see the same thing. They're based upon tiers. And it's $789 for a tier 1 shortage for CAG or D cost for the actual water for supplementing the excess groundwater that was pumped. And those same additions will be added. If you're going to go to a tier 2, you'll add about $15. If you go to tier 3, you add $30 to those numbers. And so that's a quick and easy way to see what your effect will be on this. What's next? We're looking for a lot of things right now. We're looking for additional conservation on Lake Mead. Even though we are down below the 1075, doesn't mean we don't want to continue to look for system conservation on Lake Mead. Maybe we can put enough system conservation there to avoid a tier 2B or a tier 3 and stay above those. So any chance we have to keep more water in Lake Mead, we need to do. I think it's important for everybody, but we absolutely believe this is not just an Arizona burden. This is all the lower basin burden. We all need to do it together. So when we're looking at putting more water in, this is a burden that everybody needs to be a part of. When it comes to coming up with new sources of water, we're looking many, many years in the future, but we have to look 20, 30 years in the future for new sources, in addition to conservation, in addition to making sure we have our fair share of what comes out of the Colorado River. These include desalinization studies. We've been looking at additional desalinization and exchanges with Mexico, where we put desalinization in the Gulf and bring it up to Yuma, and in exchange, we can take more water out of the Colorado River. We're working with Metropolitan Water Department, where we could put money and help them take effluent and have direct delivery of effluent in California in exchange for us pulling more water out of the Colorado River. And of course, shortage sharing agreements with other lower basin agencies. So we're looking at quite a few different things that we can bring new sources of water and what we can do to maintain that elevation in Lake Mead and reduce these potential lower elevations. One of the big things you got to remember is we are going into, and we've already started, we're probably a year into reconsultation. Reconsultation means we are essentially renegotiating the 2007 shortage sharing agreements with both the lower and upper basin states. That needs to be done by the end of 2026. And that includes NEPA and congressional approval and legislative approval, and especially in Arizona. It's a long process. We're well into that. And remember, DCP only works till the end of 2026. And this new reconsultation is what's been occurring right now. And believe it or not, 5 years is quite short. It's not a lot of time to get to where we need to get in 26. So that's where we are. You can just look at this for more information and take advantage of it. CAP News site is a great site for more information and supplement what I talked about today. So I went through it pretty quick. And any questions? I'll take what questions I have at the time I have.
We have just a couple minutes. Again, if anyone has a question, please raise your hand and feel free to unmute.
Amanda, go ahead.
Hi, thank you, Mark. This was a great presentation, very helpful. I was just curious if you know anything about communities that don't directly recharge their CAP allocation. Are they going to have any infrastructural limitations, conveyance or treatment or otherwise, if they see any cuts? I'm thinking about once we reach tier 2, et cetera, and we have M&I cutbacks. Thanks.
Well, obviously they don't have, how do you say, the great system we have in Southern Arizona and Tucson water, where we've recharged a huge amount of excess water for years. While we have 144,000 acre feet, which I really have to credit Mayor and Council of Tucson Water for buying all of it every year and recharging it, and we only use about 90. We've really stored a huge amount of water underground, and we have a recovery system to pull it out during a shortage. So even if we get a 5 or a 14% reduction, we have that water underground, stored away, and ways to recover that water. Where a lot of communities have don't have that wonderful aquifer, don't have the ability to recharge it, and they just have treatment plants. So it makes it much tougher for that situation. What they do have is the Arizona Water Bank. The Arizona Water Bank is there just for those reasons that when there is a shortage, most of this will be firmed up to a certain amount, but the Arizona Water Bank is there to firm a lot of the water that these folks will be shorted in a shortage. And that's, of course, for the M&I. Most of it will be in long-term storage credits. And that means they still have to have a mechanism to pull that water out of the ground. They still have to have recovery wells in their service area where they can take the long-term storage credits from the Arizona Water Bank and recover it and still meet their assured water supply obligations. When we start delivering wet water, we still have a lot of work to do on recovery, where that recovery is going to be and how we'll serve folks. I'm sorry, well, CAP and the water bank will serve wet water, but the water bank is there to firm M&I during shortages and to produce a buffer for that.
Marie, this is Mitch Vasevsky. Mark, if you could advance to the next slide. I just want to make sure that we promote our CAP University, which is it's open to the general public. It's free, it's online, it's coming up in just a couple of weeks. It's about 2 hours of an overview of CAP, everything from the system and how it works to the power sources that we use and that we're going to be using in the future. More information on shortage, in addition to what Mark already told you, and other issues that CAP deals with, like sustainability and climate change, things like that. So please let everybody in your orbit know that we would love to get as many folks from the general public. We're not a water utility like Tucson Water, so we don't have a direct way of contacting individuals in the public, like through bill inserts. So please let everybody know that we would love to have them go to this website and register. And when you finish the class, you'll get a little certificate that said you have graduated a session of CAP University, and maybe some other little goodies as well. Thanks.
And then the test is pretty tough. That final is a rugged final. So, but we have this. I'm glad you said that, Mitch. It's important to see that. We probably have a CAP University about every 3 months, 4 months now. So they're very worthwhile, a couple hours long, a huge amount of information.
Thank you very much for your presentation and also for putting together the university, the CAP University. And I know I have people in mind that I can send this to. I know that we have run over time to our scheduled time to meet. And so what I wanted to do was to thank you all very much for participating to learn about these 3 important topics about PFAS that is being discharged into our wastewater systems and also into the surface waters, as well as what we're doing, what Tucson Water is doing to clean up the groundwater contamination, at least the early phase in doing testing. And also for all our planning for drought management and keeping everybody apprised about what people can do proactively. Thank you very much. And is there a motion to adjourn the meeting? I can't see if anybody is.
I motion to adjourn.
Thank you, Paula. Do I hear a second?
Second.
Thank you very much. And the meeting is now adjourned at 3:16. Thank you all very much for participating.
Thank you.
And thank you, Marie.
You're welcome. Marie. You're welcome.